Auction, the trader shouted. $6 for the pair. No refunds, no questions. Amos Reed would change everything for two sisters no one else wanted. Though on that ordinary morning in Coyote Springs, with the dust still settling behind his wagon wheels, he did not yet know it. He had come into the trading post for axle grease and a box of nails. Nothing more, because the road to Tucson would break a wagon that ran dry on either one. Rio Salado country did not forgive a man who traveled unprepared, and Amos Reed had made a study, these 11 years, of never being that man. He was 43 years old, weathered the color of the land itself, and he had sworn off two things a long time back, trouble and violence, because he had paid for both once already, in a currency he had no wish to spend a second time. He tied his two mules to the post rail and stepped into the sour, close air of Harlan Crase's trading post, promising himself, as he always did in that place, 10 minutes and no more. It was not 10 minutes. In the back corner, on the dirt floor between two barrels of nails, sat two women. The older one had a tether looped once around her wrist and knotted to a ring bolt in the post behind her. Not cruel exactly, not a rope meant for dragging, just a rope meant as a reminder. The younger one wore no rope at all. She simply had not moved more than a foot from her sister's side since whatever hour they had been brought in, and the stillness of her told Amos plainly that leaving was not a thing she had considered, not while her sister sat anchored to that post. He knew Apache dress on sight, the particular indigo in the older woman's skirt, the deep blue certain bands along the Tonto country dyed into their wool, the fine, tight stitching of the moccasins, work that takes a woman years to learn and a lifetime to perfect. Neither woman lifted her eyes to him. He bought his nails. He bought his grease. He kept his voice level and his face level, and the question about the women stayed unasked, because some part of him already knew the shape of the answer and had no wish to hear it out loud inside that room. Two men lounged near the door the whole while, watching the exchange with the mild passing interest of men watching weather change, and neither so much as glance at the women again once Amos had bought his goods and stepped back out into the yard. That indifference sat worse in him than open cruelty would have. Cruelty at least admitted there was something at stake. This was simply commerce, ordinary as a sack of flour, and the sisters sat through it with their spines straight and their eyes fixed on some point past the far wall, giving the room nothing of themselves it had not already taken by force. He got as far as his wagon. One hand on the sideboard, he looked at the toes of his own boots a long moment, grit lifting off the yard on a hot wind, and then he turned around and walked back inside. Harlan Crase was already watching the door, wearing the look of a man who has decided what he intends to charge you before you have opened your mouth. Something else you need? Those two, Amos returned. What's the arrangement? Reservation women, Crase explained. Widowed when their husband died in some dispute nobody troubled to name. No family left to claim them, placed in his custody temporary-like, while the agency sorted its paperwork. Men down in Tucson kept large houses, he went on, and paid well for women who could work hard and ask no questions. And he laid it out in the flat, unhurried tone of a man discussing a shipment of cornmeal, because it cost him nothing at all to put it that way. That flatness was the thing Amos would remember longest. Not cruelty exactly, only the total absence of anything that might have stopped a man from saying it plainly. How much? Crase looked him over, weighing what a trader carried and what he might part with. $3 each, $6 for the both, if you want the set. Amos reached down into his left boot, where his father had taught him 20 years and 1,000 miles ago to keep $6 silver wrapped in oilcloth against exactly this kind of morning. Keep something hidden, his father had always insisted, because a day comes when everything visible has already been taken from a man. He had never once needed those coins for anything in 11 years on the road. He set them on the counter one at a time, and each one rang against the wood like the closing period of a sentence he had not known he was writing. "Untie her." Crase loosed the older woman's wrist. She rose slowly, testing her own balance before trusting it. The careful movement of someone who has learned that speed draws attention she would rather not have. The younger woman was on her feet in the same instant, without waiting for anyone's leave. And that refusal to be led even one single step told Amos more about her than any amount of talk could have managed. He walked them past his mules, Pickett shying sideways at the strangers, while Grant, in character, ignored the entire business, and he helped the older woman up onto the wagon bed. She did not take the hand he offered. She gripped the sideboard and pulled herself up under her own strength, and he stood back and let her, because it was plainly what she wanted, and because some instinct in him already understood that this mattered more than it looked. 2 full hours passed before either woman spoke. Amos let the silence be. He had spent enough years in that country to know that quiet out here was rarely empty. It was usually working, turning a thing over, deciding what could safely be trusted with sound. He watched the trail and let the desert fill the space instead. Wind moving through the greasewood, a hawk circling wide over the wash. It was the older woman who broke it first in Spanish better than his own, which was not saying much for either of them, but was enough between two strangers. "Where are you taking us?" "I have a place 2 days east," he answered. "If you'd rather go elsewhere, I'll carry you to the edge of Apache country, and you can go on from there, or to the San Carlos agency if that's your wish. What I will not do is carry you into Tucson." A long silence, and then she asked what he wanted from them, and he gave her the plain truth. Nothing. That he had bought them because standing there watching the alternative had been more than he could bear. That he was not looking for a wife or a servant, or any claim a woman had no say in granting. She turned this low into her sister's language, and the younger woman's answer came back short and pointed. The older woman rendered it into Spanish for him. "A man who buys women and claims he wants nothing has either already taken what he wants, or he is planning to." "That's a fair reading of how most men operate," Amos allowed. Something quick from the younger woman, and the older woman's mouth moved, not quite a smile. "She wants to know if you are most men." He weighed that honestly, the wagon wheels grinding over caliche. "I don't know, I hope not. You'll have to be the ones who decide." Neither woman answered further for the better part of an hour, but the quality of the silence had shifted. No longer a held breath, something closer to a scale-finding balance. His place, at dusk on the second day, was not much to look at from the ridge. A single-room adobe he had rebuilt with his own hands across 4 hard years. A lean-to for the mules, a stone cistern that still held water sweet enough to drink. 30 acres of scrub that gave far more than it appeared to once a man worked it right. The older woman walked every wall of it in silence, checking the fireplace draw, the seam where his new storage room joined the old walls, the depth of the cistern. The younger one went straight to the lean-to, and Pickett, who tolerated no one living, let her lay a flat palm against his nose without so much as a flinch. a thing Amos had never once seen the animal permit. They had carried little enough away from Coyote Springs, but what they carried told him plenty. Winona had a small bundle wrapped in deerskin that she guarded closer than either sister guarded anything else, and Amos learned later it held awl and sinew in a half-finished basket coiled from willow and devil's claw, work too fine to abandon even in captivity. Work she meant to finish the moment her hands were her own again. Dyani carried almost nothing but the clothes on her back and a single strip of woven wool, faded, edges frayed, that she folded and unfolded each evening without ever quite explaining what it had been part of once. Amos did not ask. He had learned enough by then to know that some things a person hands over in their own time, and never before it, and that pressing for them only teaches a person to hold tighter. The older woman returned and stood in the doorway. The roof leaks at the east corner of the back room. I know it, Amos said. Haven't gotten to it yet. We will need materials. She listed what, and he promised most of it back from Tucson inside 4 days, and she told him plainly they would be here when he returned. He left not entirely certain that was true and understood somehow that it changed nothing about what he had to do next. When he came back 4 days later, loaded with everything on her list, they were there. The east corner had already been relaid with sod and sealed with a clay mixture he could not have mixed himself if his life had ridden on it. And a fire burned outside beneath something in a clay pot that smelled unlike anything he had ever put in his mouth, and turned out, once he tasted it, to be the finest thing he had eaten in 6 years. He sat by that fire and asked what he might call them. The older woman gave her true name once, Lo, and then let him know he could use Dyani, which was not the whole of her, but was enough of her to hand a stranger who had not yet earned the rest. It meant, roughly, the one who watches over. He would use it the rest of his days. The younger sister offered Winona freely, the name her own mother had given her, no guarding in it at all, because in 4 days of watching him, she had already decided there was little in him worth guarding against. If two sisters buying back their own freedom is moving you already, become a channel member. Tap join beside the channel name. It keeps stories like theirs alive. The trouble started about 3 weeks in, and Amos had half expected it, though not from the direction it arrived. A man alone with 2 Apache women in that country drew eyes, and not the friendly kind. But it was not Rough Riders who came first. It was the reservation agent, a narrow man named Corwin Vane, suit unsuited to the climate, face permanently balanced on the edge of taking offense. He rode in with a deputy and 2 men Amos did not recognize, and informed him flatly that he was harboring reservation property and would surrender the women into custody within the hour. They are not property. Wards of the federal government, Vane insisted, and Amos had no legal standing to remove them from their designated residence. Amos pointed out evenly that he had paid $6 for them inside that designated residence to a trader arranging to sell them into a Tucson household, and found it a strange hour for Vane to be lecturing anyone on legal standing. Vane's face went through several colors. Dyani appeared in the doorway of the Adobe then, not a step further, silent, and something in her stillness made the deputy look away from her twice. They are going nowhere with you, Amos said. File your complaint. I'll be in Tucson inside 6 weeks on a supply run, and I'll stand before any judge you name and lay out exactly how those 2 women came to be tied to a post in Harlan Crase's trading post, and what he intended doing with them. I expect the Tucson papers would find that interesting reading too. A long look, and Vane turned his horse and rode, his men trailing him, the deputy alone glancing back once at the doorway before he crested the ridge. Dyani crossed the yard once the riders were gone. "You would go to Tucson?" Not quite a question. "I would go to Tucson." She studied him the way she seemed to study everything, weighing its full weight before setting it down, and turned something quiet toward Winona, who gave no audible answer, though her face, when Amos glanced back, had settled into something he would learn, in time, to read as approval. Other trouble found them that season, though Amos never dwelled on it long. A man named Otis Ledbetter, who decided 2 Apache women on the place meant an arrangement he might join uninvited, and left with an entirely clear understanding that he was wrong. 2 of Vane's men, who rode up one night and reconsidered their errand once they found Amos waiting at the fence line with a rifle and a lit lamp. He kept none of it for the drama in it. He kept it only to explain the shape of that first year, vigilance and labor, and the particular exhaustion that comes not from work, but from never fully setting a guard down. What surprised him was that he no longer carried it alone. He had been alone a long time, not lonely exactly. He had made his peace with solitude, but alone, and it was a difference he had forgotten how to name until it was gone from his life. Dyani found the spring on the east slope that Amos had walked past 100 times without seeing, and Dyani turned it, across 4 days of work that would have cost him 2 weeks, into a proper stone catchment basin. From that morning, the place had water it had never held before, and every possibility on that land changed with it. She did not offer this as a gift precisely, and in time he came to understand why. She wanted his attention, not his gratitude. And the difference between those 2 things matters more than most men ever learn. She taught him without once naming it teaching. She would be mending leather or shaping the runoff along the catchment wall or working clay for a repair. And a man paying attention learned something true every single time. And a man who was not paying attention got no second showing. Amos paid attention, slow about a great many things by his own reckoning, but never that one. By the close of the 3rd month, he knew which desert plants she gathered and roughly their purpose, knew the Adobe's upkeep better than 4 years living in it alone had taught him, knew the wind off the east slope in late afternoon meant nothing valuable stayed uncovered in that stretch of yard. Her hands were working hands, not damaged but well used, every joint certain of its purpose. And when a difficult thought turned over in her mind, she worked the knuckles of her left hand slowly with her right thumb, the exact motion he used, unthinking, on the silver ring he wore in his own right hand, and catching his own habit mirrored back in someone else. The first time felt like finding handwriting in a language he had believed only he could read. Winona was a different sort of watching altogether, a young woman still becoming who she meant to be, visibly before anyone's eyes. English came to her faster than Amos would have believed possible, the way the young take a thing whole, without self-consciousness, filing it away until the moment she needed it and producing it complete. Within the year, she carried translation for Dyani in English whenever the Spanish ran too slow between the 3 of them. Her opinions about the mule's feed proved correct. Her opinions about grain storage proved correct. And her opinion of a hairline crack in the north wall, one Amos had judged merely cosmetic, proved anything but. "Wait for spring," she warned him flatly, "and that corner falls." He tended it that same week. The corner held. Dyani's skill went well past plants and roofs. Late that first summer, Grant came in from the east pasture favoring a foreleg swollen tight around a puncture no bigger than a thorn prick. And Amos, who had doctored animals his whole working life, could not name what had bitten the mule or what to do about it. Dyani took one look, sent Winona for a particular gray leaf shrub growing along the wash, and built a poultice from the crushed leaves and river clay that she changed twice a day for 4 days running, murmuring low to the animal the whole while she worked until the swelling broke and drained clean. She had learned it, she told him only when he pressed, from her own grandmother who had learned it from a woman 2 generations further back, a chain of hands and knowledge running further into the past than anything Amos's own family had ever bothered writing down. He asked once whether she minded him watching her work. She told him watching was how a thing got carried forward, and that she would rather he watch than let it die with her. And he understood, hearing that she had decided something about him he had not yet earned the right to ask about directly. What Winona wanted, Amos came to understand slowly, across months, was never softness. She had not been raised to it and had little hunger for it now. What she wanted was steadiness, the rules of a place holding firm from one day to the next. She tested this constantly in small ways he did not always catch at the time, asking him to see to something and watching whether he did, warning him a thing needed fixing and watching whether he listened, putting questions to him that carried no wrong answer except in how a man chose to meet them. He did not think she was fully aware she was doing it. He thought she had spent so long reading the ground beneath her for stability that it had simply become the way she moved through any world at all. And when, somewhere near the close of that first year, she stopped testing him and simply began living beside him instead, it ranked among the finer feelings of his life. The winter that followed came in hard and sat down and stayed. Amos fell sick through most of February. Not dangerously, but the kind that would have turned dangerous faced alone, fever that would not settle, sleep swallowing whole days. He remembered lying in his blankets one gray afternoon, uncertain whether it was morning or evening, gripped by the sudden, complete conviction that he had imagined the whole of the last year, that there was no one else anywhere in that house. Then the door opened, and Dyani came through it with water, and knelt, and pressed the back of one cold hand flat against his forehead, and it was the most real thing he had felt in longer than he could measure. Still too hot. I know. She stayed on the stool by the fire through the changing light, mending a piece of beadwork in her lap, feeding the fire when it wanted feeding, and he fell asleep watching her hands move in the firelight, and woke to find the fire banked properly and the blankets drawn back over his feet, which he always kicked loose in the night without knowing it. You didn't have to do that. I know. And that was the whole of it. And lying there, he understood something in him had shifted that he was not yet ready to name. He was well within the week. Spring came late that year, welcomed all the more for the waiting. Dyani showed him which plants were rising and which were worth the harvest now against which needed to wait for summer, and Winona spent 2 weeks gentling a pair of feral horses she had found running the east slope, a mare and a young gelding, until the gelding trusted her hand enough to accept a hackamore, a patience Amos genuinely admired from the fence rail. A rancher named Cyrus Boone rode through in April to water his herd at the new spring, a straight, unhurried man Amos had traded with honestly for years, and he sat an hour over coffee watching the sisters move about the place before he finally allowed, "You've built something out here." "We have," Amos agreed, and Boone nodded like it was exactly the answer he had expected. Boone returned in June wanting to talk grazing rights on the east slope, And inside minutes it was plain that Dyani understood the land better than either man in that yard, and Boone was sharp enough to deal with whoever actually understood the thing under discussion. She drove a harder bargain than Amos would have managed alone, and the terms landed better for it. Dust settling behind Boone's departing wagon, she watched a long moment. "He will come back. He is a good man." "I think so too. Good men are useful." And the sound she made was not quite a laugh, but lived in its neighborhood, and Amos found himself smiling at the fire for reasons that had very little to do with Cyrus Boone. By the start of that second summer, the household had begun reaching outward on its own, past Amos's trading routes entirely. Dyani took to riding into Tucson twice a season with preserved foods and woven goods to sell direct, rather than let Amos carry the trade for her. And it was there she first crossed paths with a Quaker widow named Ruth Calloway, who ran the dry goods store on 4th Street and bought everything Dyani brought without once haggling her down, which Dyani noted, dry, was rarer in that town than good water. Winona, meanwhile, had built a small reputation of her own among the ranches scattered along the corridor for gentling horses other men had given up on, and rode out alone now to do it, paid in coin or trade, answering to nobody's schedule but her own. Amos watched both of it happen with a feeling he did not have a tidy name for, something like pride, though it was not quite his to claim, since neither sister had built any of it for his benefit or with his help. They had simply used the ground he'd given them to plant something that was entirely theirs. The second summer was when everything came due. Vane returned in July, this time with a territorial marshal named Hollis Tate, carrying papers signed by a territorial judge, removal papers, authorizing the taking of unauthorized Apache persons from private land. Tate was nothing like Vane. He had done most of what a frontier could ask of a man and come through it upright, and it showed in the careful way he held his hands and read the document slow, allowing afterward, in a tone that sounded like he half meant it, that he was sorry about the business. "Give me half an hour. Take what you need." Dyani had heard every word through the open door, and when Amos came inside, she showed no surprise, only the settled look of a woman long finished expecting the worst, simply confirming its arrival. "I'm going to fight this." "You will lose." "Probably. I'm going to fight it anyway." A long study of him, and then, translating her own words as she found them, she gave him something close to a blessing, that in her people, when a man stood and fought for those inside his house, it was never because he wanted something from them, only because they were his to stand for. "I understand now what kind of man you are. I will go with the Marshal today, because fighting him here only makes it worse for all of us. But you will go to Tucson, and you will fight, and we will see what comes of it." "Where will they take you?" "San Carlos," and she gave the name the way a person names a place they have deliberately decided not to fear. Before Amos rides to Tucson to fight for them, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name. Members keep these frontier stories coming each week. He assured Marshal Tate he understood the papers and would raise no trouble, that Dyani and Winona would go with him peaceably, and that he would be in Tucson inside the week to file whatever needed filing. Tate met his eyes steady. "You know the odds against you. I'm going anyway. I've done this work since before you were shaving," Tate allowed, settling his hat. "And in that whole stretch, I've known maybe 4 men who did exactly what they promised they'd do." Nothing further about it. Dyani came out with a small bundle and never looked back once the horses started moving. Winona looked back a single time, found Amos still standing in the yard, and something passed between them that carried the length of his ride to Tucson. Tucson that summer was its own trial. Heat that thickened thought, dust that coated every word spoken in the street. A growing territorial town straining loud to be more than it was. Amos took a room above a livery he could barely afford and lay awake most of that week listening to wagon traffic and dogs and men arguing over cards through the thin wall, counting the days against the promise he had made at the fence line. And more than once he woke before dawn from a dream he could never quite hold on to except for the color of it, which was always the particular indigo of Dyani's skirt on that first morning in Crase's trading post. Amos found a lawyer named Emmett Voss, a man who had read law and passed his examination, but never practiced anywhere respectable enough to turn away the case Amos brought him, and Voss listened without cutting in once, which Amos counted among his finer qualities. Amos laid it plain. He had purchased 2 women from a trader conducting, in effect, a sale of persons, a crime, and their status as reservation wards had been compromised the instant the agency placed them in that trader's custody for exactly that sale. Voss chewed his cigar a long while. That's actually not terrible. Give me a week and $50. Amos gave him both. He also brought a signed statement from Cyrus Boone describing the grazing arrangement, proof the sisters were functioning partners in a legitimate enterprise on private land, and he spent half a day earning a second statement from a Quaker widow named Ruth Calloway, who kept the dry goods store on 4th Street and had bought preserved foods from Dyani on 3 separate occasions. Ruth heard him out, quiet a long while. I have watched more Apache women than I can count pass through this town in the hands of men who claimed they were protecting them. She gave him plainly, no accusation in it, only fact. I have written letters. I have filed my own complaints. Nothing has come of any of it because the men who profit from the arrangement are the same men who administer it. She wanted to know why this time would be different. He gave her the honest truth. It might not be, but his argument was specific to these 2 women and this trader, not a general complaint against the whole rotten system, and a specific case sometimes lands where a general one never could. She wrote the statement, signed it, handed it over. I hope you're right. So do I. What he had not anticipated was a third letter, from Marshal Tate himself, judging in writing that the 2 women posed no risk to the territory and that their continued residence under Amos's roof was, in every practical sense, preferable to the cost of holding them at San Carlos. Tate owed him nothing of the kind. He had served his papers and gone. Amos never learned why the Marshal chose to spend that particular risk on 2 Apache sisters he owed nothing at all, only that he had and that it mattered. The judge, a tired, careful man named Halcomb, took 2 days over the filings before dismissing the removal papers outright and sent a letter of his own to the territorial agency questioning the arrangement at Coyote Springs and naming Harlan Crase directly. Nothing formal ever came of that inquiry so far as Amos learned, but Crase shuttered his trading post within the year and moved on to country nobody bothered tracking him into. Ruth Calloway, when Amos stopped to give her the news, allowed only, "Good," and returned to her inventory, and he stood on the boardwalk afterward and let 4 days of held breath finally leave him, which he found does not happen quietly. He rode to San Carlos and brought them home. That is the plain way to say a hard thing. 4 days through August heat, 2 fresh horses led behind his own, and when Dyani and Winona came through the gate, he saw a contracted quality in how they carried themselves. a smallness that was not how they moved on their own land, and he made no mention of it, only stood and let them look over the horses he had brought, watching the smallness slowly leave Winona's shoulders as she checked the near horse's feet exactly the way she checked every animal she meant to trust. Dyani's eyes found his across the yard, and she gave a single nod, and he returned it. And they rode for home, needing nothing further between them. They camped the second night beneath a sky Amos had never found the right words for. Huge and entirely unguarded, as if it had given up any pretense of being less than everything it truly was. Dyani studied him across the low fire. You went to Tucson. I went to Tucson. And you won. Voss and Tate helped. Quiet a while, turning something over, and then slow, translating her own words as she found them. In my people, when a man does a thing for those who live in his house, it is not because he wants something back. It is because they are his to do it for. I have thought of you these weeks, not doubting you would go. I needed to understand what kind of man you were once the choosing turned hard. A pause, the fire between them. I understand now. He trusted himself with no answer to that, and the fire moved between them a while, and after a time she gave the rest of it. We are in your house. That is our answer to your $6. If you needed one, I do not think you do. I don't. From the far side of the fire, eyes closed, Winona put in, took you long enough, and Dyani made the sound that was almost a laugh. And Amos looked up into that enormous sky and understood with real clarity for the first time exactly what he had bought that morning in Harlan Crase's trading post, and that it had never once been two women. It had been this. They rode home the next day, and the season that followed was the gentlest the place had known, the catchment full, herbs drying in bundles along the storeroom rafters, Dyani's careful hand in every corner of the adobe now, Winona's laugh carrying across the yard at odd hours for no particular reason at all. It did not last undisturbed. Harlan Crase, having lost his post and half his standing over the affair, had never forgiven the $6 that started it, and in the last cooling weeks of that second summer, he rode east with 3 hired men, meaning to take back by force what the law had already told him he could not have. Amos caught the dust of their approach from the ridge before he heard the horses, and there was no mistaking Crase riding at the front of it, a rifle laid across his saddlebow, his face set in the same flatness Amos remembered from behind that trading post counter, the look of a man who had already decided a thing costs him nothing to take. Amos had sworn off violence a long time back, had paid that price down to the bone once, and never meant to pay it twice. But watching 4 riders come on hard across his own land, he understood that some debts a man does not get to walk away from a second time. For one long breath he thought of simply loading the wagon and running east, of putting distance between the sisters and every man who thought $6 and a bad faith bill of sale gave him a claim on 2 human lives. He thought of it the way a man thinks of an easy road he has already decided not to walk. Running would have kept them safe for a season, maybe 2, and it would have taught Dyani and Winona the one lesson he had promised himself. Standing in Harlan Crase's trading post that first morning, he would never let either of them learn from him that safety and freedom were 2 different prices, and that a man who claimed to want nothing from them would still, in the end, ask them to fold themselves smaller so he could keep them. He was not going to be that kind of good man. He was going to be the other kind, the kind that stood. He did not face them alone. Dyani was already at the fence line with the old rifle he kept oiled and ready, calm as still water, and Winona had slipped down toward the lean-to the instant she caught the dust, moving fast and low, because she alone among the three of them understood exactly what four strange horses smelled like to Pickett and Grant, and to the half-wild pair she had gentled off the east slope that spring. Amos stood in the open yard and called across the last stretch of ground that they were trespassing on titled land, that a territorial judge had already ruled, that this was their last chance to turn around while it still cost them nothing. Crase laughed and came on regardless, certain a trader and two Apache women would never truly stand against four armed men. He had that wrong. Winona threw the lean-to gate wide the exact instant the riders closed the last 100 yards, and the loose horses broke across their path in a wheeling, dust-blind rush that scattered Crase's men before a single shot needed firing. Two riders thrown clean into the scrub. Dyani's rifle spoke once, deliberate and controlled, taking the hat clean off Crase's head rather than any part of the man beneath it, a warning too precise to be mistaken for anything less. Amos closed the last distance on foot, unarmed but unhurried, and made it plain to Crase that the next shot would not be aimed so carefully, and that he was welcome to explain to Judge Halcomb exactly why he had ridden armed men onto land the court had already settled. Crase looked at his men picking themselves from the dirt, looked at Dyani's rifle already reloaded and steady on him, and made the one sound decision left to a man who had built his whole life on taking what cost him nothing. He turned his horse and rode, and his men rode with him, and none of them were ever seen along the Rio Salado corridor again. The dust took a long time settling, longer than the fight itself had taken. Amos stood in the yard with his heart going hard against his ribs, and for a moment none of them moved, the three of them just breathing, checking each other over with their eyes the way people do after a thing that could have gone very differently than it did. Winona crossed to her sister first and touched her arm, said nothing, and Dyani touched her back, and something passed between the two women that Amos understood he was not meant to be part of, only to witness, and he let himself simply witness it. Winona was laughing first, walking the skittish horses back into the lean-to with the easy competence that had never once left her since the day she touched Pickett's nose in a stranger's yard, and Dyani set the rifle down slow and met Amos across the settling dust with something in her face he had waited the better part of 2 years to see plainly. You were not going to run. Not a question. No. Neither was I, and that more than anything spoken across any fire before it was the moment Amos understood the shape of the rest of his life. The seasons that followed were kind in the ordinary way. Seasons are kind to people who have earned a little peace. Cyrus Boone came for supper most Sundays his herd allowed, and he and Dyani argued cheerfully over water rights in the character of cattle in a way that had become, Amos noticed, its own particular form of affection neither of them would ever call by that name. Winona met a young horse breeder named Tomas, half Mexican and half Pueblo, running a modest operation 30 miles north, a solid, unhurried man who showed up when he said he would and loved her with the kind of steady, decided love that renews itself every single morning rather than resting on the memory of the day before. Amos liked him within a season, respected him within 2, and stood beside Dyani the day Winona rode north to build her own house on her own land. Understanding that losing her from under his roof was no loss at all, only a widening of it. He had watched the whole courtship unfold slower than either young person likely realized, Thomas riding down to trade horse sense for a share of Winona's time at first, then simply riding down. No excuse offered or asked for, and Winona meeting him at the fence line earlier and earlier each visit until there was no pretending the horses were the reason anymore. Dyani had approved of him from the start in her own quiet way, judging him not by his manners, but by whether the animals he brought were well kept, whether he listened when Winona corrected him, whether he showed up in weather that would have given a lesser man an excuse to stay home. He passed every one of those tests without appearing to know he was being tested at all, which Dyani said was the surest sign a man was worth trusting. It was an ordinary autumn evening, 4 years on from that first silver dollar morning, when Dyani set down the mending in her lap and wanted to know whether he remembered what he had promised her in the wagon that first day about wanting nothing from her. "I remember. You were wrong, or I was in doubting you. I have thought long enough now to know which." She looked up at him then, which she did rarely and always on purpose. "This is your house. We have made it ours. I would like it to be truly ours, not merely shared. If that is a thing you're working your way toward asking, then here is my answer, before you find the courage to ask it." Amos Reed, who had sworn off a great many things in his life and kept every one of those vows until this exact evening, found he had no wish to keep this last one. They were married that winter at the fire they had built the whole of a life around. Winona and Thomas standing witness, Cyrus Boone arguing cheerfully one last time over whether the ceremony belonged to Dyani's customs or Amos's church. Until Dyani settled it herself, insisting on both, because both were true of the life they had actually built together. There was a morning some years on, riding back from a 9-day supply run east past the Gila settlements, when Amos came up over the last ridge before home and saw smoke standing thin against a gray sky, and felt something settle in his chest he had no better word for than the feeling a compass gives when the needle finally stops hunting and points true. He had organized the whole of his younger life around movement rather than arrival, and here at last was the smoke, and the spring below it, and the east slope, and the fire with Dyani beside it. He understood coming down off that ridge that he was not riding home. He already was home, and had been for longer than he had let himself notice. When Winona's eldest daughter came of age, Dyani rode the 30 miles north herself to help see her through the 4 days of the sunrise ceremony, teaching the girl the songs the way her own mother had taught them to her, and Amos stood at the edge of that gathering, an outsider by every right, and was made welcome anyway, because Dyani had made certain, long before that morning, that her family's ways would never be a thing practiced in secret or apologized for under his roof. The girl grew up fluent in her mother's and her aunt's language both, and fierce with horses the way her aunt had been, and she called Amos grandfather of the house without anyone ever having to teach her the words twice. Amos is an old man now, giving this the way memory gives things, in weight rather than order. Dyani still sits at that fire most evenings, her hands never quite still reading the land before it shifts beneath him, still right more often than he is about the things that matter most. Winona's children use a word for him that translates roughly to grandfather of the house, and he answers to it now without correction, the way he stopped correcting a great many things once he understood they were simply true. He kept the oiled cloth his father handed him, the one that once wrapped 6 silver dollars, folded small in the chest in the back room, though the dollars themselves went to a man long gone from this country and are never once missed. His father had insisted on keeping something hidden, because a day comes when everything visible is taken from a man, Amos thinks now his father meant it differently than he first understood. Not a coin held in reserve, but the willingness in a man to act when the acting costs him something real. $6. A week in a Tucson summer that wanted to kill him. A rifle held steady at a fence line by a woman who was never his to protect, only his to stand beside. He did not know the morning he emptied his boot onto Harlan Crase's counter that he was buying the whole of the life he would go on to have. He only knew, watching that fire now with Dyani's hand resting easy in his, that he would spend every silver dollar again and count himself the fortunate one for the spending. Some evenings when the grandchildren have gone in and the coyotes have started up along the ridge and Dyani has finally let her hands go still in her lap, Amos finds himself back at that trading post counter without meaning to, watching himself set down 6 coins one by one, and he thinks about how close the whole of it came to never happening. One wrong turn on the road. One morning he decided the axle grease could wait. One lesser version of himself who walked out of Harlan Crase's building the first time and did not walk back in. He does not know what became of that other life, the one where he never turned around. He only knows the one he has, the fire, the 2 women who chose to stay long after they were free to leave, the wide sky over land that gave everything back once it was asked properly, and he has stopped wondering whether he deserved the getting of it. Some nights that is simply enough to have it and to know exactly what it cost and to be glad every single time that he paid it.